Hello there. I wonder what you think is the greatest need of the church today. Maybe you think it's holiness or unity or good preaching or perhaps more prayer. I would say that all of those are needed, but the greatest need is a true knowledge of God. So here's a question for you. When I say the word God, what kind of thoughts come into your mind? It's actually a critical question because the answer that you give, that anybody gives, will be revealing. A.W. Tozer famously once said, what you believe about God and what you think about when you think about God is the most important thing in the universe. What you think about when you think about God is the most important thing you'll ever think. As we come to Isaiah 6 in these studies, one of the best known chapters of the book, of course, it's really important to see it in its context within the book as a whole. Chapters 6 to 12 form the next major section of Isaiah's prophecy, but obviously it builds on what has gone before. In chapters 1 to 5, through his prophet, God has set the scene, asking of his people, what more could I have done for you? And then comes chapter 6, with Isaiah's call to ministry, which leads into 7 to 12, with some very specific issues and promises in the early reign of Ahaz, the grandson of Uzziah, and then the section ends on a message of hope in chapter 12. And you see, chapter 6, which is often treated almost as a standalone passage, only really makes sense when you study chapters 1 to 5. In chapters 1 to 5, we've seen Israel and Judah, sinful, rebellious, and so on. And yet they will ultimately, promises God, be the means through which the world will hear the gospel. But in order for that to happen, they need purifying through judgment, and Isaiah's own experience is going to be a model and an example of that work of God. And the main reason that Israel and Judah live as they do is because they have failed to see, to grasp, to understand the holiness of God. Friends, I have no doubt that the reason that the church, that Christians in general, that you and I live as we do, is because we have failed to see, we have failed to grasp and understand the holiness of God. Indeed, some of us never have seen or understood this all-important truth. The Church of Christ, you and me as individuals who are believers, are called to be the means by which the glorious gospel of the grace of God will be heard and seen in our communities, in our places of work and study, etc., and etc. But like Judah of old, our vision has become distorted because of our sinfulness. And we too are in need of that purifying and cleansing so that we can really be of use to God. Friends, I want to ask you, do you want to be useful to God? And if so, then it begins here with a heart-stopping, breathtaking vision of the reality of the holiness and the purity of God. Friends, I'm utterly convinced of the greatest need of the church today, the greatest need that you and I have, and I say this unhesitatingly, is a new, fresh vision of the living God. John Calvin opened his famous institutes by writing, nearly all the wisdom which we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. Man never achieves a clear knowledge of himself unless he has first looked upon God's face. What will shape and direct us, lift us from the ordinary plane of life, release us from obsession and fascination with trivial, fleeting things of this world, will be a fresh vision of the stupendous glory and incomparable holiness of God. What will empower us for holiness and for godly living will be a fresh vision of the breathtaking glory and holiness of the living God. What will equip us to impact and transform the communities and world in which we live will be nothing less than a fresh vision of the incomparable, indescribable glory and holiness of God. So let's get into Isaiah 6, this familiar story and vision, especially the first 8 verses of this passage. However, we must take it as a whole and see the inbuilt structure of this chapter. And just as chapter 6 only makes sense in light of chapters 1 to 5, so actually verses 8 to 13 of this chapter only makes sense in the light of the first 7 verses. You can't truly hear and respond to the voice of God unless you have first seen the face of God. And this passage is built around 3 responses of Isaiah to something he either sees or hears. Again, I want you to notice that in these verses, in 4 and then 8 and 11, you have this same structure. I saw, says Isaiah in verse 1. Verse 5, I said, and then in verse 6, the seraphim speaks. In verse 8, I heard. Verse 8, I said, and in verse 9, and God said. And then in verse 11, Isaiah says, I said, and in verse 11, and God said. So today we're just going to look at verses 1 to 7, and God willing, next time we'll look at the rest of this wonderful chapter. But let me make a brief comment on verse 1. This is more than a sort of chronological reference point. This itself has deep theological and spiritual significance. Uzziah, who's also known as Azariah, has at this point in time been on the throne for 52 years. Most of that time he was an effective, good leader. Judah flourished under his rule. According to 2 Chronicles 26 and 2 Kings 15, sadly he became proud. He attempted to burn incense in the temple and was punished by God with leprosy and lived the rest of his life in isolation while his country was ruled by Jotham. So after this time of great stability and prosperity, everything changed. Everything is shifting. Everything is uncertain. On the world stage, Assyria is flexing its muscles. It's drawing near. It's threatening the country. And so the question on the people's lips is, who will we turn to? Who will we depend on? Who will we trust? That's the dominant question of this first section of Isaiah. I think it feels a bit like that at the moment in our own world, as the tectonic plates of our world are shifting. So we need what Isaiah was given in his day, a fresh vision of God. And notice verse 1, in the year the king died, I saw the Lord. Verse 5 says, my eyes have seen the king. In other words, in the year that the king, small k, died, I saw the king, capital K. So what did he see? Well, he saw the Lord, verses 1, 8, and 11. And then the Lord, capital letters, Yahweh, elsewhere in this chapter. We read in John 12 that what he actually saw was the face of God in Jesus Christ. God who is the sovereign one. God who is the surrounded one. There's burning ones, there's angelic beings with eyes covered because even the most glorious of creatures dare not look at the face of God. Their feet are covered. In other words, shielding the ordinary, the mundane from the extraordinary God. They're flying and there's this antiphonal praise. But God is also the separated one. He's the holy God. The Hebrew works in superlatives. He's not the holiest. Hebrew doesn't say that, but he's holy, holy, holy. And holiness above all speaks of distinctness and difference, which leads to moral purity and perfection. This is the one that Isaiah saw, and it shaped his entire ministry. His favorite title for God in his prophecy is the Holy One of Israel. And that's what we need, friends, to shape and mold us. A vision of God, a God who is everything that we are not. C.S. Lewis said, the real test of being in the presence of God is that you either forget about yourself altogether, or you see yourself as a small, dirty object. It is better to forget about yourself altogether. In God, we come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to and different from ourselves. And unless we know God as that, and therefore, as a result, know ourselves as nothing in comparison, we do not really know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud person is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, as somebody has said, you cannot see something that is above you. And Isaiah comes to a realistic knowledge of himself because he has come to a fresh and realistic knowledge of his God. Now, nothing less than that, I believe, is what we need. We need a vision of the blazing holiness of God. How we need to be crushed under the awareness that God is not some heavenly buddy. He's not some benevolent, divine, grandfatherly figure who sits in heaven. He's not some supernatural ATM dispensing grace and favor on demand for our personal convenience and our personal comfort. He is a God who is greater than the entire known universe. He is a God who is white hot in his perfection and in his holiness. So that's what Isaiah saw. But what did he say? Well, he confesses his own sinfulness in verse 5, and he confesses the people's sinfulness. And look at chapters 1 to 5 that we've been thinking about. During the reign of Uzziah, the nation had prospered materially, but it was in a terrible condition spiritually. The economic growth and temporary peace were a sort of veneer that covered a nation that actually had a wicked heart. And now Isaiah acknowledges and affirms that he himself is no different. He is an individual example of everything that he saw going on around him. And so he asks, how can I survive? How can we survive? Friends, if you've never felt and sensed that, at least to some degree, I genuinely question whether you are really saved and converted. You know, the most telling indicator as to whether God's grace is really making an impact in our lives is when we continually see ourselves as utterly undeserving, innately sinful, the chief of sinners, the lowest of the low. Somebody once said, I'm not great, but at least I'm not as bad as, pointing to a friend. Friends, my opinion of myself, indeed others' opinion of me, is utterly unimportant. What matters is where I stand and how I see myself in relation to God. And in the presence of this incomparably holy God, and with the cries of the angelic beings declaring over and over again the holiness of God, there's only one genuine response. Woe is me, says our prophet. That's why I say, bold as it may sound, if we've never felt that, if we've never sensed that, at least to some degree, I have to question whether we are really saved and converted. And if we've lost the sight of that, then we need to cry to God for a renewed sight of that. So that's what he saw, that's what he said. But what did he sense? Well, he sensed purifying pain on his lips, because his lips are the overflow of his heart, the tool of the prophet. And of course, it symbolizes purification through atonement. And every altar, such as the altar from which these coals were taken, every altar in the Old Testament points us to the great altar, which was a cross on Calvary's Hill. And the only way that we can be cleansed, and the only way that every part of our being can be renewed and purified, is through the sacrificial work of Christ on the cross. So friends, until we've seen God like this, we're never going to be able to respond to him in the way that he demands, which is, of course, what we'll look at next time as we look at the second half of this chapter.